Aloha, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the second session of the US-Singapore Tech and Innovation Virtual Dialogue, Making the Digital Leap, Innovation and Transformation. My name is Crystal Pryor, and I'm Vice President of the Pacific Forum. Pacific Forum's new US-Singapore Tech and Innovation Virtual Dialogue is a 6-part online series plus digital publication that will examine the collaborative partnership between the United States and Singapore in fostering digital innovation and resilience in Southeast Asia. This series emphasizes the US and Singapore's central role in driving technological innovation in the region against the backdrop of great power competition in the post-COVID-19 era. Participants will reflect on existing developments in digital innovation and nascent areas that are ripe for collaboration. The series will also encourage creative and critical thinking to identify other unexpected disruptors for future collaboration. By the end of the series, we hope the participants will have a better grasp on how the US and Singapore can spur digital growth through improved policy coordination that facilitates practical engagements on the exchange of talent, data, expertise, technology, and best practices, which will have positive flow-on effects in the region. The first session, session 1, titled Digital Connectivity, Security, and Governance, which we held last month, explored regional trends, challenges, and opportunities within ASEAN's digital landscape. The session explored COVID-19's effect on the pace of digitalization of economies and how the recovery of ASEAN will be contingent on the speed of technological development and implementation. We also looked at US-Singapore regional cooperation and how the partnership excels in the creation of spaces for cooperative businesses. We see great potential for our two countries in critical areas such as AI development. Finally, ASEAN's digital transformation should focus on both hard and soft infrastructure, including not only the rollout of digital infrastructure like 5G, but also producing human capital with the skills to operate efficiently in the digital age. The key findings and video recording of the first session will be available shortly on Pacific Forum's website. Today's session of the US-Singapore Tech and Innovation Virtual Dialogue, Making the Digital Leap, Innovation and Transformation, will tackle the ongoing digitalization and digital innovation in fields such as e-commerce and manufacturing in Southeast Asia amid the global pandemic. The discussion will dive into key issues, including the acceleration of digital transformation in small, medium, and large businesses during the pandemic, the new reality of businesses adapting to digitalization, and the increasing divide between micro and large businesses or companies. Our speakers will share their insights on how digital transformation positively affects these industries, while highlighting concrete challenges faced, especially among micro, small, and medium enterprises. Please note that remarks made in today's program are on the record, and a video and audio recording of this session will be made available on the Pacific Forum website and social media in the future. We are also live streaming this event. Sakshi Chadha, digital expert for Bangladesh at the UNCDF, will moderate the discussion, which will include feedback and Q&A with the audience. Participants will be allowed to unmute their mics to ask questions or give feedback. Participants' cameras are disabled throughout the session. We will also have interactive features like polling as we go along. Here is today's first poll. In your opinion, do you think smaller firms are more or less likely to adopt digital practices as compared to larger firms? Do you think they're more likely, less likely, or the same as larger firms? I'll give a minute for everyone to respond to that. All right, let me share the results from this. So we actually had 58%, the majority of respondents, saying that smaller firms are going to be less likely to adopt new digital practices, a quarter saying more likely, and a little bit less than 20% saying about the same. And I have one more question for you. Close this one. What is the biggest barrier to successful digital transformation for small and medium enterprises? Do you think it's lack of digital infrastructure, lack of digital culture or awareness, internal skills gaps, or is it financial gaps such as covering the high fixed costs associated with digitization. So what do you think is the biggest barrier to successful digital transformation for small and medium enterprises? And while we're waiting on those poll results, I will note that we will have a survey at the end of this event we would like you to complete. It will become available on the series website near the end of the event. So you can view this and the series event website at the link in the chat box now. So I will share the poll results with you now. We're just getting a couple of extra respondents in. Share the results. So we had a tie actually between lack of digital infrastructure and financial gaps. And then those were the first choices. And then we had a tie also in the second choices, which were lack of digital culture awareness and internal skills gaps. So we'll see if the speakers agree with those poll answers or if you feel differently after this event concludes. And now we're going to head into today's session. I will hand over the mic to Sakshi Chadha to take it from here.
Thank you, Crystal. Hello and welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. It's a pleasure for me to moderate the discussion today and explore this topic further with our speakers. As the world still struggles to confront the COVID-19 pandemic and its dire consequences, there is no doubt that technology has fundamentally reshaped our day-to-day lives. Technology has changed how children are taught, jobs are created, health services are delivered, trades are conducted, businesses sort of happen, farmers get access to information, financial services are delivered, and the list goes on. Technology has enabled us to stay connected socially, professionally, and as consumers. Innovation that were nascent or slow to pick up over the last couple of years or over the last decade are now integrated into our everyday lives, while also shaping new pathways to progress and development. Actually, in fact, according to a McKinsey global survey of executives conducted last year, companies have actually accelerated digitization of their customer and supply chain integrations and of their internal operations, by about 3 to 4 years just during this pandemic. And the share of digital or digitally enabled products in their initiatives has also accelerated by a shocking 7 years. And these are global figures, by the way. The development on the Asia Pacific side stands a lot taller than what global averages talk about. Digital adoption has taken a quantum leap at both the organizational as well as the industry levels. Just because of the pandemic or during the pandemic. Despite the positives and the promising outcomes that have continued and are continuing to emerge, there is a growing concern that such outcomes would not be inclusive, particularly for underserved communities in the world's 46 least developed countries. During the COVID-19 response, many least developed countries were not able to pivot their economies and education systems online, and marginalized populations like women, youth, migrants, people and disabled or smallholder farmers suffered, or were not able to pick up or sort of ride on the digital wave that the rest of the businesses were able to. For over a decade, a UNCDF team has engaged and supported the digital finance ecosystem and the diverse array of companies and institutions that can support the digital transformation we seek. Telcos, banks, microfinance institutions, fintech companies, ministries, regulators, donors, and PAU and agencies have been some of our partners while we've been at it. UNCDF's initiatives in the digital financial inclusion space, which have actually connected about 18 million people in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, is now the foundation for a team to sort of more actively take this work forward, especially in light of the pandemic, and approach the new level, leveraging digital payments to provide much needed services in energy, health, education, business management, e-commerce, among other services. In fact, we've also sort of created this tool called as Inclusive Digital Economy Scorecard, which is a strategic performance and policy tool with the intention to support countries to better understand the status of their digital transformation. How well prepared are they to take this digital leap? To what extent are they leveraging digital transformation and innovation as the topic for the discussion today? And we help them identify main priorities to accelerate development and make their overall digital transformation journey a bit more inclusive. If I just talk about Asia, from 2015 to 21, we've reached about 7 million clients, of which 33% were women. We've enabled 100 plus partnerships to advance access to service. We've we have a loan portfolio with clients which we have facilitated of around $121 million, and we've unlocked 161 million from public and private sources. So it gives me immense pleasure to actually be here today in front of you, and to have the opportunity to speak to our speakers later and take this discussion forward. With this, I would now like to introduce my esteemed speakers for today's session on making the digital leap, innovation and transformation. Before I get there, just some house rules maybe. So this is a friendly reminder for our speakers to please keep their presentation to about 15 minutes max, so we have ample time for questions and discussions later. Overall, the session is 90 minutes total. We'll have 2 speaker presentations followed by Q&A. Just for our participants, please, you may raise your hand or submit your questions in the Q&A box as you have them during the presentation. Please don't wait till the end, and we are very happy to collect your questions and pose them to our speakers as the opportunity arises. So therefore, without further ado, today's presenters for the session are Lydia, who's the founder and CEO of Think Technique, and Michelle Wong, who's the Senior Manager of Policy for Asia at the Information Technology and Industry Council, ITI. Let me start by introducing Lydia briefly, and then I'll hand over the floor to her. So Lydia is the founder and CEO of Think Technique, a digital full suite agency and marketing consultancy service for large and small clients in Asia Pacific region. Her previous positions include head of marketing at Grab and digital strategist at Singtel. She was the winner of the Silver Award at the Digital Asia Festival 2012, as well as the winner of the Best Use of Search at the Singapore Media Awards 2012 and Best Spoke Award from Singtel. Lydia, it's such a pleasure to have you here with us, and you have the floor, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Crystal, for the introduction, and thank you, Sashi, for the introduction as well. First of all, I would like to thank Pacific Forum for inviting me to be part of this Making the Digital Leap, Innovation and Transformation series. So when I got invited, I've learned that this series, particularly this dialogue between the US, Singapore Tech and Innovation virtual dialogue, it will examine, and I quote, the collaborative partnership between US and Singapore in fostering digital innovation and resilience in Southeast Asia. And I believe that this series that you've created this year is really relevant for us during this time. It's very challenging, as we all know, and we're all in it together. And yet it's been equally exciting. And I don't say this in a disrespectful way, but I mean, in the tech space, in digital and tech space, I think it is exciting times from what we see. So I'm part of the early millennial generation. In fact, I'm the first generation termed as millennial, which according to studies is anyone born between 81 and 96. So being at the cross junctions is actually a unique position. I feel that it allows me to understand millennials and beyond who have grown up on a digital diet, as well as Gen X and before who are not digital natives. And for most of my childhood, I didn't know computers, internet, which only came in during part of my schooling days. But now I've had the chance to spend about 15 years in the field in digital. So I started off with multinational agency, and then I joined an SME in its early days, and then I jumped to client side to join telco, and then fast-moving tech startup, which is Grab, and then to now having an agency that I started in 2015. So the COVID pandemic, actually shows us how human we are, I feel. And staring into the mirror and it actually shows us how, the fragility of our being. But at the same time, actually what we are able to do is exponentially changing and transforming. And this is facilitated by advancements in part due to digital technology. So in the last few years, during the pandemic, we have actually experienced, greater acceptance and adoption of many digital experiences. And some of these, just to name a few, are like remote working, use of online tools for productivity and teleconferencing communication, acceptance of e-commerce, food and goods delivery services, cashless payments. So we see a shift of businesses towards online commerce. And in Singapore, we've gotten so used to using an app to scan. We call it safe entry wherever we go. So this is for the government to track whether to keep us safe, right? To keep the public safe, to see if you're vaccinated, then only you can enter into certain areas. And so we've gotten so used to our movements being tracked by this. So I think that we don't think about it anymore. Even my parents also used it without thinking, right? And they don't belong to a digital native generation. So I feel that the changes that we've experienced in the last few years don't just impact like technology itself. More fundamentally, it creates changes to our beliefs, our psyche. And it reminds me of how, when they did this, scientists, right? They wanted to study monkeys. I'm not saying that we're monkeys, but we could learn from the experiment. So just like the monkeys who found out, like when they press a button, then they realize, oh, a sweet drink will be given to them. So then they've trained themselves to just press the button repeatedly to get more of the sweet drink. So we too, we have trained ourselves to experience changes in digital usage in the same way, right? We get this pump of adrenaline when we check our notifications, right? And things like that. So the increased usage of digital during this pandemic, I feel leads to this. It's a fundamental change in our psyche, not just the technology itself. I had some time to think through some of these questions. So, for example, what kinds of fields or industries have benefited from digitization and will stand to gain? So allow me to be a bit controversial here. I think that this question is flawed because digitization has by now disrupted industries far and wide. So there's opportunity in almost every industry. But I feel that what we should look at instead is which functions, which business processes and services have, or can benefit from digitization and which still stand to gain. So what I mean by this is like, instead of verticals, looking horizontally across industries and identifying what are these functions, what are these processes, what are these services that we can benefit from digitization. So for instance, like in the past few years, how during the pandemic, I talked about things that have changed, like remote working. That's actually how we work. So one of the kind of functions or processes that we should look at is across industries, how we work. This is a hybrid remote working and its implications. Number two is how we shop. So the embrace of e-commerce. In Southeast Asia, e-commerce is shooting up even further. It's already got a high usage, but now during the pandemic, e-commerce is even more increased. And then number three, how we transact. So this is the fundamental shift in behavior, like I talk about using trace together and being used to the safe entry, tracking of movements. Similarly, when we transact now, at least in Singapore, we use a lot of cashless payments. And even like, the older generation, they're not like, no, the cashiers don't look at them and say, oh, sorry, you're from this generation. Okay, fine, would you like to use cash? No, they just across the board, all the service staff always, the first thing they ask is, would you like to pay by, this QR code, we call it Pay Now, or would you like to pay by, PayWave, which we just tap as this, or pay by your app. So fundamentally, how we transact is also changing, like digital and cashless payments. So however, having said that, when we look at like organizations, coming on board, right, we see some organizations who are slow or slower to get on the bandwagon, so to speak. And this is not generational thing. It's not how old you are. So I have an example of a young businessman. He's in his 30s. He's younger than me, but we were giving a presentation to him, and he is the owner of a rather large size MSME. However, so we were trying to share with him how to use digital to build a marketing pipeline, and we realized that he had he almost seemed afraid of it, or did not have a basic understanding of how to use the outreach tactics to build this pipeline. And I remember I was sharing with my team member about email marketing, and I was quite shocked when the answer was, no, please, this is a B2C tactic. It does not apply to B2B business like mine. So I was kind of puzzled, because someone who is obviously successful in what he does, he's the owner of a successful business. He has more than 50 employees. He has businesses operating in various trades, and he's only in his 30s, but he thinks that email marketing is only for B2C. So we tried to share how we successfully implemented email marketing for a B2B MNC client of ours, and how it generated lots of leads for their sales team and closed deals, but he was having none of it. So this leads me to think that there is an issue of a knowledge gap. The issue that we face, and a lot of you took the poll just now and mentioned that perhaps it's about infrastructure. I think the poll result shows that most people think it's lack of infrastructure or financial gaps. However, I like to challenge that and say that it's internal skills gaps and lack of awareness that is more critical. Because the issues that we face is this mindset. We need this mindset shift in a lot of SMEs. And lots of times, I think, perhaps speculating, or from what I see, SMEs are predominantly run by business owners. Business owners cannot be expert in everything. So usually he or she is the expert who decided to come up and set up something of their own, or a generalist who spotted some opportunity in a certain industry and trained themselves up to be the expert in that field of business. So they're typically, kind of typecast this way. So they're not the experts in digital. So whatever they're not expert in, they tend to shut off, or push aside. So this fundamentally, I think, is the invisible block that we need to break down if we are to help SMEs further their digital adoption. Yeah, and I think we can help in this manner, like with policy. We can help facilitate discussions. We can help have initiatives, collaborating with certain organizations, for example, training organizations, schools, or other businesses, to provide them with a kind of training or kind of manpower at almost no cost to them. Because one of the things that typically they would ask is, how much does this cost? and in Singapore, there's a lot of government grants, and we're very appreciative of that. And lots of times, SMEs during this pandemic will not do anything if there's no government grant. Yeah, so I think that we need to, both on a financial assistance level as well as a educational level, help to shift the mindset of SMEs towards digital innovation. Yeah, and so another thing that we have seen is increase in social media. So usage of social media has increased during the pandemic. Our time on social media has increased because due partly to boredom, or we can't go out. There is little increase in the number of users, but the increase in usage is there. So social media can be used to polarize opinions, and people have now discovered that they all have a voice and anyone can pick up the microphone, which leads us to think about contribution. What I mean by this is, what should we do when we can do anything? what should we do when we can do anything? So in the age of digital transformation innovation, we are, able to do things that we, exponentially, tech has enabled us to do a lot of things. And we now have a voice, but what is our contribution? And this points us to how can we, businesses, governments, organizations, cooperate to do good. And one of the big areas that I think about beyond cross collaborations of public partnerships, I think that's one, where governments can learn from those who are the practitioners, and practitioners can help, formulate some policy making decisions. The second thing that I think is equally important is ethics. So technology and ethics. And there are big issues that we should start discussing now and not after something happens. So for instance, I'm not sure if you know of Project December. And this was basically, it's an AI project that was started by Jason Rohrer. I'm not sure I pronounced his name properly, but it's based on an AI system called GPT-3. And basically, it is GPT-3 is a piece of software that is it's an AI system that manipulates human language. And what this helped someone do, so a user of this Project December software communicated with his deceased fiance. And that created a lot of discussion around ethics and death and technology. And, when we think about, and I can discuss this more during our panel discussion because I'm running out of time. But if you think about it, technology is inherently not just good or bad, it just is. It's a resource, much like how water, electricity, and it's a resource, money is a resource. But we need to stop getting caught up in the innovating of technology so much that we fail to think about the ramifications of its development. And there's VR and metaverse. So I'd like to quote this and end off that Gerd Leonhardt said this in his book called Technology versus Humanity, The Coming Clash Between Man and Machine. He said, just because we can doesn't mean we should. And I believe we need to step back from an expert-led debate about what's possible and how to achieve it. Instead, I think we must start with a more fundamental exploration of what role we want these transformative technologies to play in serving humanity. Just because we can doesn't mean we should. So thank you. That's the end of my presentation.
That was great. That was great, Lydia. Thank you. Thank you for your informative presentation. You've made some very interesting points, and I just wanted to touch upon them for the interest of our audience, quickly, and encourage them to ask questions and post them in the Q&A section so that we can come back to you with those later. But it was interesting to see how you sort of blended from the individual level adoption of digital transformation or digital in the day-to-day life, such as e-commerce, such as cashless payments, and that sort of transcends across age. Very aptly put, and whichever market we are in, those challenges of the generation before adopting digital sort of remains, but they have quite easily. But then you sort of moved on to talk about organizations and how some have been slow, some have been quick, especially pointing towards this very interesting piece of maybe the fact that some of these SMEs are a bit resilient when adopting technology or digital that openly as bigger organizations. It could be the knowledge gap and clubbed with digital infrastructure financing gap and other pieces. And there are pieces I would definitely want to explore with you a bit more, when we sort of go to the Q&A section on the aspect about the kind of support that's available in Singapore. You'd mentioned briefly about a grant to promote digitization. So, such or similar initiatives in the country, maybe we can explore. But I think that definitely like how you sort of closed it all, that technology is definitely sort of a resource that's available to all of us. It's really how we use it, how we leverage it. And we'll definitely touch more on that as we move to the discussion later. Thank you for that, Lydia. And next
Thank
up
you.
is Michelle Wong, who serves as the Senior Manager for Asia on the policy team at the Information Technology and Industry Council, ITI. Just briefly, ITI promotes public policies and industry standards that advance competition and innovation worldwide. Michelle comes to ITI from US ASEAN Business Council, where she led the council's work on financial service, customs, and trade facilitation, and even managed multiple industry initiatives in Indonesia. She previously worked in government relations consulting, advising clients from a broad range of sectors, including ICT, cybersecurity, and telecommunications. Michelle, it's a pleasure to have you here with us. Over to you, please. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And I think are my slides up here? Perfect. Great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me here today. And thank you to Crystal at the Pacific Forum for hosting, to Sakshi for moderating, and to my fellow panelist, Lydia from Think Technique. Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm very happy to be a part of this event, highlighting opportunities for a strong US-Singapore and US-ASEAN relationship to collaborate on digital issues. My name is Michaela Wong, and I'm the Senior Manager for Asia Policy at the Information Technology Industry Council, or ITI, which is a trade association representing 80 members across the tech industry. And you can move to the next slide. These members include hardware and software, telecoms, platforms, payments companies, and almost a quarter of our members are headquartered outside of the US. So while ITI's headquarters are in Washington, DC, we do take a global perspective in our advocacy work, and that's helped by our international presence, including offices in Brussels and Korea, and our partnership in Beijing with the US Information Technology Office. So we engage governments around the world, but for the purposes of today's conversation, I'll focus on our engagement with the US government as it relates to the US-ASEAN relationship. There's no doubt that ASEAN member states, including Singapore, are critical partners for the US. You can move to the next slide. On a positive note, under President Biden's leadership, the US has prioritized sending higher level officials to international gatherings in the Asia Pacific. In August, Vice President Harris made a trip to Singapore and Vietnam to reaffirm US commitment to the region, as well as to discuss global supply chain issues. This year was also the first time in 4 years that a US president attended the East Asia Summit. And during that summit, Biden announced the development of an Indo-Pacific economic framework. US Commerce Secretary Raimondo made a separate trip to the region this month to underscore the benefits of the framework. And while we don't know many details about it, what we do know is that this is a new approach to US economic engagement in the region, especially compared to the CPTPP or TPP at the time when the US withdrew in 2017. For instance, Secretary Raimondo emphasized that the framework would not resemble a traditional trade agreement, and the US government has no plans at this time to rejoin the CPTPP. But within and beyond this new economic framework, there are some really amazing opportunities for partnerships between the US and Singapore when it comes to the digital economy. And ITI and others in the US have been urging USG to take more of a leadership role in digital trade in the Indo-Pacific and in ASEAN in particular. And the digital economy will play an essential role in enabling a strong economic recovery for all countries. And there's certainly a positive story to tell when it comes to Southeast Asia's digital economy. You can move to the next slide. According to the recently released report from Bain, Google, and Temasek, the ASEAN internet economy is expected to reach about $360 billion by 2025. Digital consumption continues to rise in ASEAN, and pre-pandemic users are consuming on average 4 more digital services than they did before 2020. So the question is, how are governments building on this growth? You can move to the next slide. Well, it's great to see that Singapore is proactively seeking cooperation on digital issues, including through the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement with Chile and New Zealand, and the Singapore-Australia Digital Economy Agreement. We can move to the next slide. There are also many areas of cooperation that the US and Singapore can pursue jointly. The first being the harnessing of the US-Singapore Partnership for Growth and Innovation, which stems from an MOU signed last month between the Commerce Department and the Singapore Ministry of Trade, and focuses on strengthening the bilateral investment and trade relationship. So we expect the digital economy will play a really large role in this partnership, and we're glad to see that it will include joint activities, including the Singapore Internet Cyber Week, the International Energy Week, and the Singapore Week of Innovation and Technology. So we're really glad to see that this new initiative is leveraging the fantastic organizations and events already in place. We also hope to see more of the US and Singapore working through existing ASEAN institutions, such as the ASEAN digital sector, because the US and Singapore don't need to reinvent the wheel here. There are lots of existing opportunities for collaboration. Perhaps one of the areas that can be developed through ASEAN is digital upskilling, which is a hot topic for many governments and certainly for both ASEAN countries and the US. And this area is really ripe for opportunities for joint training and education programs to secure a strong digital workforce for the future. Public-private partnerships, as Lydia mentioned, are really essential in this, and training workshops, employee exchange programs, those can be part of the solution here. Another area that is not actively under consideration, but could be a big opportunity, would be a digital trade agreement, which would holistically address the challenges for companies regardless of size or industry. And this is certainly more of a long-term aim, since the US government has given no indication that they're pursuing DTAs at this time, whether it's something that the US would lead or whether it's joining an existing agreement like DIPA. But to give a sense of what the US government is focusing on, the Biden administration has focused its trade policy rhetoric on worker-centric policies. So in other words, the US government is looking at trade policy decisions through the lens of middle-class Americans. And this is really a key part of the US political climate right now. And it's been driving all of the Biden administration's trade policies. So whatever steps USG takes toward developing digital economy partnerships within the ASEAN region, it will need to prove that it fits within this worker-centric policy. So much of Singapore and ASEAN's economic goals revolve around promoting SMEs, and that's incredibly important, but it's also important to remember that the US government is evaluating its trade policy on the basis of US workers. So other governments should bear in mind that domestic policies will be judged on the basis of their impact on American workers and businesses when you're considering trade agreements. So that's something I would keep in mind when you're thinking about the US-Singapore trade relationship under the Biden administration. We can move to the next slide. So all of these opportunities for partnerships are threatened by the challenges brought on by digital protectionism and data restrictive policies, which have blossomed throughout the pandemic, including in some countries in ASEAN, as governments across the world really try to strike a balance between leveraging the digital economy for economic prosperity and protecting national security interests. But stronger partnerships between the US and ASEAN states are really key here in pushing back against these protectionist trends, not only for the companies that ITI represents, but also for SMEs and consumers. And these challenges include policies like data protection laws, which continue to establish onerous process requirements, which means unnecessary costs for companies and deters innovation in the participation of SMEs in the digital economy, not to mention degrading the user experience and also threatening interoperability for companies of all sizes. Data localization policies, or when a government requires companies to store data within its borders, is on the rise in the region. Restricting data flows reduces the potential for an innovative digital economy, which ultimately makes it costly and complicated to do business in those countries. A report from the Information Technology and Innovative Foundation found that data localization policies have sizable impacts on a nation's economy, including sharply reducing its total volume of trade, lowering its productivity, and increasing prices on downstream industries. They also require companies to apply additional resources toward ensuring they're within compliance with these data localization policies, which can be an enormous burden for SMEs that already have limited resources. One emerging trend that we've seen is that governments around the world are increasingly looking to address policy concerns related to digital services through standards-based or technical regulatory governance approaches. So these concerns may relate to cybersecurity, AI, or privacy, while digital services may include everything from cloud computing to financial services provided across borders. For an example of this, the lack of alignment on cybersecurity policies also threatens interoperability, which includes certification programs that may discriminate against foreign companies or are duplicative to other existing certifications. So instead of this, we recommend that governments use relevant existing international standards to shape regulation instead of relying on country-unique or region-unique standards, which can create technical barriers to trade for all companies, both large and small, and threaten interoperability, especially for SMEs looking to expand into new markets. So the US and Singapore can collaborate there by encouraging development and adoption of standards through international standard setting activities. Another opportunity would be exchanging information and continuing to share best practices through bodies like the US-ASEAN Digital Trade Standards and Conformance Working Group. Singapore can also raise the importance of international standards in their engagements with other ASEAN states. And finally, on the hardware side, local content requirements and attempts to facilitate import substitution to enhance local manufacturing create additional disruptions to the supply chain at a time when companies are already facing higher costs and longer waits for parts, in some small part due to the pandemic. So overall, the Singapore-US relationship is very special, and as is the US-ASEAN relationship. And there are plenty of opportunities to collaborate on digital economy issues. The underlying challenges that impact those foundational technologies in the ICT sector need to be addressed in order to strengthen these economic partnerships and establish meaningful progress on these issues, which will in turn ensure the prosperity for companies of all sizes. So I will stop there. But thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to diving into the discussion.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Michaela. This was very interesting. Great to sort of, see how you sort of took us quickly through how the partnership has evolved over the years, what has changed recently, especially under the Biden administration. Thank you for pointing that out. Again, summing up some pieces that I would want our audiences to make a note of or come back with follow-up questions on. So it was sort of interesting to see how Singapore is definitely proactively seeking digital, or you pointed towards how digital upskilling has been an important component, or how the US policy around trade agreements would be focusing on worker-centric policies, so looking at the American middle class. But you also made some interesting points around the challenges, the key challenges that sort of exist for such sort of partnerships between US and Singapore, but in general otherwise as well, or US ASEAN region. The aspects such as data protection policies, data localization, and how it's better to have a more outward looking approach, I think is what you were referring to, having rather than having a more inward country focused standards having implications on costs that businesses face. No, this is very interesting. Thank you. Great. So I'll again urge all the participants that please feel free to type in your questions in the Q&A section. We already have a question lined up, and there are some that I have for my speakers. So maybe I'll pick up the ones that we already have and look forward to more questions coming in. So this month, for starters, Lydia, I was hoping that maybe we could start with you with our first question,
Sure.
and going back to some of the points that you'd made earlier. So from your engagements in Singapore with different kinds of clients that you work with, as you indicated, the span of organizations you've actively worked with, from Grab, Singtel to SME consulting, supporting them with the digital journey now. So what do you think are the crucial components, for businesses to make this digital leap? And in that sort of crucial components, what sort of partnerships do you think are needed? What key challenges do they face? Could you highlight or throw a bit more light on this, please?
Okay, sure thing. Thanks, Sakshi. I think just pointing back to what I've shared during the talk, I think there is a difference between the way that certain organizations take the leap into digital or try to innovate there, and it depends on what frame of mind they're coming from, what's their mindset, and I think we need to start there. And how do we I wouldn't say convince, but share, like akin to the monkey experiment, where one monkey tries it first and then the rest realize that this is good, and then they all start to do the same thing. How do we do that as well for these organizations which are lagging behind adopting digital transformation? So there's a lot of barriers and resistance due to part of some belief systems, like they just maybe close off to some of the things that they know that they need to do. The difference between what I've seen in when I was working in larger organizations, which I used to work in MNCs and telcos, I would term that as the MNC is part of it. And then I think I'll talk about tech startups separately. So what I've seen during my time with the telco was there was still resistance in the telco with certain groups of people to adopt new ways of doing things. I was the first kind of digital marketing team that they set up in the consumer marketing division. And when we were there, it was very difficult to share with the other departments how digital is actually, something that they should actively use in their campaigns. So when we were working there, there was no use of social media for, say, promoting a new phone launch or service. There was little tracking that took place, and so what we did was, my team set up this interesting tracking when we did up a campaign together with Google. So we worked together with Google and our partner agency to make sure that the advertisement that went out was tracked in terms of which one was a more popular product compared to the rest. So because to give a backdrop, all departments had to share this one big banner on YouTube during that time. So there were 4 or 5 different departments like fighting for the space to be on this banner that goes up on the YouTube homepage. So by tracking, we enabled some stakeholder management, like we could tell which ones were performing, and then therefore, we would pull out those which didn't. And I believe that this helped them to see the benefits, like they could see how many people were actually interested in their product, clicked onto their pages, and so on and so forth, which led to real sales, which was what they needed to track as a KPI. And Google later told me that we were the first in Asia to actually do this kind of tracking. Back then, it wasn't a norm, so I was pleasantly surprised. But I think that we can, that we can adopt this for SMEs. In SMEs, it's much smaller, but and they don't have someone in-house like we used to do in the telco days, where we have a whole team which kind of acts as the advocate to say, hey, we should do this in digital, and why don't you try this, and I'll show you the results through measurements. SMEs don't have that, and they're struggling on a day-to-day basis of dealing with lots of issues. So who's going to take up that role? So that's why it's not so, it's not so much a surprise if you see that. Why are they slow to adopt some of them? They're just thinking, I have so many things on my plate already, yet another one. So if we can share with them a way, like, how the monkey experiment, right? One of them, maybe some case studies, some best practices. And I'm not just talking about like top down, like governments and government linked organizations telling the SMEs, saying, hey, this is great, you should do this, you must do this, go do this. It's not that way. But how about on a peer basis, like at the peer level, like other SMEs successfully adopting certain practices. And so these other SMEs who are laggards can see and feel that they are kind of at the same stage as them. And therefore, if they do this, they can also thrive during this pandemic. So that, I think that's one thing that we can look at to facilitate the transformation. So I'll pause here because I'm not sure. Let's discuss, and I can add on as we go.
Absolutely. No, this makes sense. This makes sense. I think I completely align with that example, and that's something that we relate to as well. The intention for many our engagements or interventions in different markets is to sort of ensure that we reach a pilot stage. It could be through digitization or leveraging some sort of newer technology, and with the intention is actually to demonstrate that in the market, that that sustainability through such a pilot is possible, and then it's out there for different players in the market to adopt, to learn from. And in a way catalyzing the process. And I think you're referring to that as well. Thank you, Lydia. We actually have a question in the Q&A section, and so let me quickly go to that one. This one's from Mark Manantan, and this is for all the speakers. So in your respective positions, how do you see the imperative of mitigating the issue of algorithmic bias and transparency developing in Southeast Asia on top of existing issues concerning data privacy, security, cybersecurity? And then how can the US and Singapore cooperate on this front? I think a very, very relevant question, sort of building onto the points that Michaela was talking around on privacy, security, and cybersecurity. May I request, Michaela, for you to please step in on this one? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Mark, for your question. So what I'm hearing from your question, a little bit what Lydia talked about previously as well, was concerned around building trust, not just with SMEs, but also consumer trust as well, which is a really important element for governments looking to incentivize businesses to engage in the digital economy, and for SMEs to encourage people to use their services. So this element of gaining this trust needs to be built into the programs that governments put together jointly, including whatever comes from the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework or from the Singapore and US MOU. These need to be built into those frameworks, because there's no point in governments putting out initiatives if people aren't going to use it, or there's going to be drawbacks later on.
Thank you, Michaela. And just sort of twisting this one a bit for you, Lydia. While sort of Michaela looked at it more from the policy perspective, and how the partnership between the two countries or in the region sort of could adopt or pick up and make sure these issues are mitigated. If I look at from the business point of view, or from customers who you might be engaging with, what sort of strategies do you see? How are they sort of mitigating the issues around these? Yeah.
Okay, so I think concerning data privacy, you mean, or perhaps we can look at cybersecurity. I think that's one thing. Michaela talked about trust, and indeed it is the fundamental thing that we should look at. There was a case in point, very interestingly, about I don't know if you know about Squid Game. It took the world by storm. So someone came up with this Squid Game cryptocurrency. I don't know if you've heard of it. And so interestingly, it climbed from 0 in value to like 30,000 per coin or something like that. And one day, the creators of this Squid Game coin decided to call it quits and pull the plug, and they ran away basically with millions of dollars. So that is, yeah, that is what's happening now. And I mean, it also shows how people, what do we do about this? And does this impact the trust that has been built up? So while we're talking about things in digital, we cannot also ignore the fact that we have cryptocurrencies that are, rising in popularity. And these things are happening. So after that, do we see a decrease in trust in crypto, in investing in digital platforms, in putting your money on the digital space? Do we see a decrease? What is the impact? So I think that there are a few things here, and with regards to this question, because there are these issues of data privacy, security, and cybersecurity on one hand. I think it's important to address it. And then on the other hand, we kind of know as a given that these issues will be there when we use, it's like inherent inside the resource, like technology and digital platforms. It's inherent inside. I was talking with someone else who used to work together with me in my previous company. So he's trained in digital for many years as well. And I was just chatting with him about how your handphones could be tracked, and your data could be leaked out. And I was surprised because instead of saying, okay, let me check my privacy settings, he actually said, anyway, they've been tracking us for a long time. So I'm okay with that, So there are people who are actually okay with their data being tracked or shared or stolen. But I find this quite a shocking thing. And I think we need to draw some kind of balance. I think what Michaela shared just now was really interesting, where you said about how we should look at a shared kind of view on these policies, like not just as individual countries, what are our different types of standards, but as a whole, what is that kind of baseline that we should look at? At least we have this guiding point to help us when we work on cybersecurity. Yeah, and another thing also to kind of segue a bit is how SMEs are actually like one of the top targets of cybersecurity attacks. And for some of our clients, we have actually experienced some of the hackers. I mean, these are very simple, basic kind of hacking where they take over your website homepage. And we get it restored, within a couple of hours. But basically, hacking will continue. And so for companies, whether large or small, how do we work together on this basis? I think that what we could do is to have shared discussions and maybe training programs, shared simulation programs, sharing on both sides from US and Singapore on how we can deal with cybersecurity attacks. Yeah, so to kind of go back to Michaela's point on how this could benefit the domestic economy, I think if we could sort of have joint sharings like from both countries on how Singapore could, say probably take a case study of a certain some organizations which are domestic organizations, domestic businesses in the US, and how Singapore companies could help them in this area of digital and cybersecurity, perhaps. I'm just thinking aloud, and share our learnings from the region and share that across, and then vice versa. Like in the US, what have they experienced as domestic businesses in the US, and how that can apply to some of the things that we do here in Singapore, where the privacy laws are not as strict maybe, or I would say not really highly enforced, such as they are in the US, or say the respect towards privacy laws isn't really at the same level, and for different reasons. So this might be something to look at. I don't know what Michaela thinks about that though.
Yeah, I completely agree. And particularly in terms of cybersecurity, I think it's really important to remain focused on the same goals, which is to make the digital economy benefit as many people as possible, to create opportunities for businesses around the world by reducing trade barriers, and to stay coordinated as governments and share information effectively, as well as having a strong government and industry relationship so that policies don't lead to unintended consequences that can hurt our businesses both in the US and in ASEAN.
Thank you. Thanks, Michaela. Thank you, Lydia. No, I think that sort of that was a great question, Mark. Thank you for bringing that up, and it sort of took a discussion to also highlight how something that Michaela had referred to in her presentation, but also sort of partnership between both Singapore and US could also look at avenues such as exploring beyond cybersecurity and the others, and also thinking about the algorithmic biases, the data biases that exist, and if there are lessons and learnings that could be exchanged, and to sort of come and this would actually have multiple benefits. This could also be actually assuming that leadership position in the region to disseminate those learnings for other economies in the region who are also looking up, many a times given both these countries are a bit far ahead in their digital adoption journeys. Perfect. So I had another question that I wanted to pose to you, Michaela. And we've sort of seems like a natural transition after Mark's question. So globally, do we see a lot of coordination or collaboration to promote coherent public policies and industry standards, with the intention to advance competition and innovation? And I'm asking this question because you sort of pointed in your presentation that it's very important, but are there examples, or on what sort of fronts could you share a bit about this, please?
Yeah, there are plenty of examples. There's the US Mexico Canada agreement, USMCA, the e-commerce chapter of the CPTPP, elements of the DIPA that certainly ITI hopes to see in future engagements for USG, including the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. And we do see a lot of coordination, and governments around the world are really trying to tackle the same question in different ways about how to balance promoting the digital economy, protecting national security, and also protecting consumers at the same time. And it's a really complicated question. And we see governments addressing this in different ways, but I mentioned the goals before, and it's just really important that for cybersecurity and privacy and these underlying policies that impact the foundational technologies of the digital economy, it's incredibly important that we remain on the same page. And with the US and Singapore and the US and ASEAN, there's many opportunities to tackle those together. And we've seen with the recent round of visits from USG that there's also a great amount of interest from the Biden administration.
Okay, thanks, Michaela, for that. This was helpful. I'll maybe pose another question to you, Lydia. And this one sort of comes back to businesses within Singapore, and you did talk a bit about your experiences working with smaller organizations as well, and the kind of challenges. You highlighted the knowledge gap early on, and maybe that's the reason why digital transformation or their adoption is a bit limited or resilient. I sort of wanted to understand what more can public or private stakeholders in Singapore businesses do, to catalyze the digital transformation further, and making sure that it trickles to the last mile. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think those organizations who are ahead of their journey could kind of pay it forward to share with those who are not yet at that level, and do it without this kind of ulterior motive of like upselling them some service, which usually is the case, what we see. So I think that would be great. For instance, that could be say a secondment of a particular manpower resource into the smaller outfit which can't afford to engage someone who has 5 years of digital experience, for example. And so this is where, I mean, as a private sector, they will not typically do this on their own. And that's where the private-public partnership can come in, where, you know, it might be led by government organizations, government-led initiatives to bring the different people together, bring the different like the SMEs and those who are a bit more advanced in their journey, as well as from a policy point of view, kind of set some kind of structure and framework to protect everyone's interest. Yeah, so that I think that this is one way that they could work together at a more peer level, so that the laggards can learn from those who are a bit ahead in their journey. Yeah, so perhaps one way. Yeah. I should I share more? I mean, I think that you mentioned just now about government support and how governments are supporting us in Singapore. So I'll just touch on that as well. I think there are a lot of government-led initiatives where they have like Go Digital, you know, initiatives, and these are both financial as well as policy-wise. But I also like to touch on something of my interest, which is like the training part of it. So what we talked about, both Michaela and yourself, Sakshi, talked about just now was about how do we help upskill. I think it was Michaela maybe, or Sakshi, I'm sorry, I can't remember. I think it was Michaela in your presentation about how we can upskill. And one of the things that I'm really thankful for in Singapore is that they've set up these programs for people who have just graduated, or maybe they are mid-career switchers and they're looking for jobs. And during this past few years, it's really difficult climate for everyone. So the government actually partially sponsors if SMEs actually take up new hires during this time in certain areas. So for instance, there is in digital, we kind of also were the beneficiary for this. So we actually took part in this training program where we train up digital executive. And these people could either be fresh grads or they could be mid-career switchers. And in our case, we took on someone who was from the airlines industry. So I mean, they're not having a good time during the pandemic, and so we trained them to be you know, a digital marketing executive. So at the end of the training, which lasted 9 months, they actually know how to come up with a digital campaign. And I think that is one way of how we can upskill. I mean, in Singapore, that's what government has supported, which I applaud. And I think that we can also continue to have such variations of initiatives to cut the barriers towards digital innovation and you know, cut out some of the problems that we face on how to upskill without a formal like go to a school and get training route. And internships might not really work sometimes because as an intern, some companies will only allow them to do certain things. So, you know, so I don't think that internships will really solve this problem. But I think such flexible arrangements, more of it is what I see will be quite interesting. Yeah.
Thanks, Lydia. No, this was interesting and great for pointing out, you know, precise examples of what worked, what didn't work, and in the airline sector, as you were talking about, the kind of support your team could provide with grants available from the government side. I'll just sort of spin this question for you, Michaela, as well, because, you know, as ITI, you would work with different organizations, you know, who would also have had similar sort of challenges, or from your experience within the US market, are there specific you know, policy supports or initiatives that you see governments have taken to ensure that the digital transformation trickle down, and, you know, with your member partners or otherwise? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I have to thank Lydia also for that example. It's always easier to hear specific cases of especially the Singapore government performing upskilling. So that's great. Yeah, the US and Singapore are two countries that do provide a wealth of information for their SMEs. In the US, it's through the Department of Commerce, and in Singapore through agencies like Enterprise Singapore. I know that in the US as well, the commercial service is very active in supporting partnerships to get more SMEs abroad to invest in the US. So there are quite a few examples of the US and Singapore governments supporting these smaller businesses. And I think as much as ASEAN countries can build up and formalize those partnerships between, for example, the US Commerce Department and their own counterparts, commerce departments, through agreements like MOUs, I think there's a great opportunity there to expand opportunities for SMEs across the board.
Perfect. Thanks, Michaela. So this sort of sums up, the sort of opportunities that are available on both sides that organizations within those countries could leverage. And I think at the same time sort of points out some lessons for other countries in the region, in the ASEAN region to learn from, to pick up and adopt where possible. I have another one for you, Michaela, if that's okay. And then maybe, I'll try and have questions that I wanted to address to the two of you. But again, I'll urge our attendees to please step in. If you have any questions, you can write them in the Q&A section, or you can raise your hand and we'll be happy to sort of get you on board as well. Yeah. So this one's for you, Michaela. Any insights you would have on, how this whole digital transformation acceleration impacts SME businesses during the pandemic? So now I'm largely referring to your member organizations and, their experiences in the market. How specifically SMEs were impacted? Yeah.
Yeah, I think the issues I laid out in my presentation really affect companies across the board, but particularly for SMEs that have a more limited amount of resources and manpower to ensure that they're in compliance or to check on each market's privacy regimes. The more harmonized these frameworks, the better off companies of all sizes are going to be. And overall, it's incredibly important for SMEs to really make their concerns known to their individual governments so that they can be elevated in bilateral conversations. There's also opportunities for SMEs to engage in industry to government dialogues to exchange this information and raise awareness around policy concerns across the industry. So also for SMEs who may not have the resources to join these more formal dialogues to elevate these kind of higher level issues, trade associations provide a great opportunity to collaborate with others in your industry and to exchange resources. So I would say if you're curious about that, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'd be happy to point you in the right direction. But as I said, the foundational elements that I pointed out in my presentation really impact industries across the board, but particularly for SMEs with fewer resources.
Perfect. Thanks, Michaela. Actually, I wanted to sort of take this discussion a bit towards, so we've sort of spoken about MSMEs and the policy actions taken both sides of the board. I wanted to sort of explore this point around the digital divide a bit further. And how and I think both of you in your presentation sort of did refer to that, and I think Lydia also made special examples around it, referring to age or the millennial, as she sort of indicated we might fall in. I just wanted to understand from your experiences. So it's great, digital transformation sort of all has helped businesses, especially in the time of the pandemic. It's sort of really helped businesses to evolve, to adopt quickly. The ones who were earlier on there to pick it up have absolutely benefited. And then there are certain governments, such as in this case Singapore, as well as the US, who've sort of done great leadership in terms of making sure that there are resources and policy framework exists to support this sort of transformation within their countries, and are putting in a lot more effort to go in that direction. But at the same time, this also takes us back to the piece that there are certain sections in in our markets or in our businesses of customers who might not be that digitally savvy or that digitally equipped. And when a lot of focus on these tools and mechanisms exist, such as customer journeys are completely digitized, we tend to leave them behind. And for us at UNCDF, we sort of work and strive towards leaving no one behind. That's sort of our agenda in the digital transformation. So from your experiences, and this one's for both of you, are there specific lessons, are there specific challenges you'd want to highlight, or maybe practices or examples that could be considered for businesses or for countries when looking at this? Maybe you can give it a go, Lydia, and then we could have Nikhil.
Sure. Yeah, happy to take this question. I mean, it's something that I think about a lot as well, about the digital divide. And you know how we talk about digital innovation and all, but how about those who, don't have access? For example, in some countries, in Singapore at least, we have high-speed internet. It's kind of a given. People expect it almost, that's what happens. But in some countries in the region, having stable internet connection is not a given. It's a privilege. And also, during this pandemic, a lot of children have had to turn to study online. And how about people who don't have a personal laptop? You know, they might not have the money to do that. And indeed, in some countries in the region, we see this happening. Villagers or people who are not in the main city areas, they might not have a personal laptop per home. In the US, maybe you have at least like one laptop per person, maybe two. In Singapore, we also kind of have like a laptop per person. But how about in the in the neighboring countries? So I think more can be done when we talk about, oh, let's innovate and all that. But how about the essential tools that we need? And organizations do have a lot of resources. I mean, it's not like we don't have organizations with resources. We have lots of organizations which are making lots of profit right now, from sale of electronics, for example, sale of consumer electronics, sale of laptop equipment, and etc. Could at least just one of these contribute to make some form of donation or some way to ground initiatives, maybe to help people actually get access to the tools that we need to facilitate digital innovation. And it's also about infrastructure, about internet connection, and how can we, make some leaps forward. Maybe telcos in the region, what can they do to push this a bit more? Those with the resources, those who are not, those who can afford to plan 5 years into the future. I think we need to look at those who are left behind. And that's one area that it's really on my mind of how we can contribute, both as businesses as well as government level as well. And then the other thing is about seniors who need now to use technology, and some of them don't adopt that fast to technology. So they have this fear of using the phone to make digital payments, for example. So what can we do to help them? And are we able to help them all the time? Is there, maybe easier way for them to get the same thing done? Or is this about training? So maybe some initiatives to help them to learn. And there are these already, but it's more sporadic. It's not like long term. It's more like, come, I train you for a few months, and this is my program, some silver initiative program. And after a few months, it ends because maybe the government funding for it ends. Usually it's done by volunteers. So what can we do to make this a bit longer? Because we know that for seniors, right, they don't learn fast. They need it repeated and repeated and repeated again. So how can we make this more long term for seniors to adopt technology? That would be my second kind of thought about this issue.
Thanks. Michaela, please, over to you.
Yeah, I think Lydia spoke really well to the digital divide at an individual level. And I think it's true for the divide between SMEs and large businesses as well. The digital divide can shut SMEs off from being able to enter into global markets, as I mentioned of the resources issue before, or in some instances, I'll give the example of for countries with very restrictive cloud services policies. This could block off SMEs, domestic SMEs, from best-in-class cloud services, which would put them at a disadvantage compared to SMEs in other countries within the region with less restrictive cloud services policies. So just add on to that.
No, brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much, Michaela. I think this sort of brings it at a nice juncture of what sort of exists and what additionally could be done, and how to make sure that we sort of don't leave anybody behind in this digital transformation journey. At the same time, leveraging the leadership different countries such as Singapore, US have shown, and what the region could look up to. Thank you for your time today, speakers. It was a pleasure to be here. Thank you to Crystal and the Pacific Forum as well for inviting me and for giving me this opportunity to moderate. And now let me pass the mic back to Crystal to make some closing remarks and end today's program. Over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sakshi, for your excellent moderation, and to our speakers, our panelists, and also our participants for joining us today. But before we conclude, I thought we'd run one last poll to see what you think based on the content of today's talks. So the question is, what is the most urgent issue for US and Singaporean policymakers to address to help SMEs adapt to the digital world? So the possible answers are training and technology assistance, access to capital, support for the development of SME-tailored digital solutions, or regulatory reforms, such as those on data protection. So while we're waiting for those results to come in, I will say that I hope you will all continue staying engaged with Pacific Forum programming, which you can find out more about on our website, www.pacforum.org. We do plan to hold the third session of this virtual series in January of next year, 2022. The topic for the next session will be digital standards relating to intellectual property and regional or global supply chains. So please do stay tuned for more details by subscribing to Pacific Forum or following us on social media. And now I will share these poll results with you all. So the top answer here was training in technology assistance, followed by regulatory reforms, and then support for development of SME tailored digital solutions. And finally, last was access to capital. So thanks so much for sharing your thoughts and reflections also on today's talk. And more on that, I would also like to remind you of the post-event survey, which we'll share again in the chat box now. We'd really appreciate if you would just take a few minutes to complete it and share your feedback so we can make sure that the future sessions in this series are as engaging and productive as possible. So thank you again to our panelists and moderator, all the participants for joining us today, taking the time to share your thoughts and making this discussion really informative and engaging. And we hope that we'll see you at future events in this series.